Tell me right, keep on walking, yeah, yeah. Keep on talking, yeah. Marching up to freedom land. Ain't gonna let you preach it, Lordy. Tell me right, tell me right, tell me right. Ain't gonna let you preach it, Lordy. Tell me right, keep on walking, Lord. Keep on talking, Lord. Marching up to freedom land. Ain't gonna let me kill it, Lord. Tell me right, tell me right, tell me right. Ain't gonna let me kill it, Lord. Tell me right, keep on walking, Lord. Keep on talking, Lord. Marching up to freedom land. Ain't gonna let no Uncle Tom, my Lord. Tell me right, tell me right, tell me right. Ain't gonna let no Uncle Tom, Lord. Tell me right, keep on walking, yeah, yeah. Keep on talking, yeah. Marching up to freedom land. Ain't gonna let nobody, Lord. Tell me right, tell me right, tell me right. Ain't gonna let nobody, Lord. Tell me right, I'm gonna keep on walking, yeah. Keep on talking, yeah. Marching up to freedom land.
Welcome everyone, and welcome during these videos we play to write comments or questions in chat, and we'll have a little more introduction after we jump right in now.
Can say concerning this great gospel singer in our midst, our dear friend, my great friend Mahalia Jackson, that a voice like this comes only once in a millennium. If there is any doubt in anybody's mind concerning whether we have a movement here in Chicago, you ought to be in this church tonight. And the time has come for America to hear the truth about this tragic war. I've chosen to preach about the war in Vietnam today because I agree with Dante that the hottest places in hell are reserved for those who, in a period of moral crisis, maintain their neutrality. There comes a time when silence is betrayal. The truth of these words is beyond doubt, but the mission to which they call us is the most difficult one. Even when pressed by the demands of inner truth, men do not easily assume the task of opposing their government's policy, especially in time of war. Nor does the human spirit move without great difficulty against all the apathy of conformity. Explicitly oppose the war in Vietnam. Additional millions cannot bring themselves around to support it. This reveals that millions have chosen to move beyond the prophesying of smooth patriotism to the high grounds of firm dissent based upon the mandates of conscience and the reading of history. Now, of course, one of the difficulties in speaking out today grows out of the fact that there are those who are seeking to equate dissent with disloyalty. It's a dark day in our nation when high-level authorities will seek to use every method to silence dissent. Something is happening and people are not going to be silent. The truth must be told. And I say that those who are seeking to make it appear that anyone who opposes the war in Vietnam is a fool or a traitor or an enemy of our soldiers is a person who has taken a stand against the best in our tradition. Many persons have questioned me about the wisdom of my path. Why are you speaking about the war, Dr. King? Why are you joining the voices of dissent? Peace and civil rights don't mix, they say. So this morning I speak to you on this issue because I'm determined to take the gospel seriously. There is at the outset a very obvious and almost facile connection between the war in Vietnam and the struggle I and others have been waging in America. A few years ago, there was a shining moment in that struggle. It seemed as if there was a real promise of hope for the poor, both black and white, through the poverty program. Then came the build-up in Vietnam, and I watched the program broken as if it was some idle political plaything of a society gone mad on war. And I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor, so long as adventures like Vietnam continued to draw men and skills and money like some demonic destructive suction tube. You may not know it, my friends. It is estimated that we spend $500,000 to kill each enemy soldier, while we spend only $53 for each person classified as poor. And much of that $53 goes for salaries to people who are not poor. So I was increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and attack it as such. Perhaps a more tragic recognition of reality took place when it became clear to me that the war was doing far more than devastating the hopes of the poor at home. It was sending their sons and their brothers and their husbands to fight and die in extraordinarily high proportion relative to the rest of the population. We were taking the black young men who had been crippled by society, sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Holland. So we have been repeatedly faced with the cruel irony of watching Negro and white boys on TV screens as they kill and die together for a nation that has been unable to seat them together in the same schoolroom. So we watch them in brutal solidarity, burning the huts of a poor village. We realize that they would hardly live on the same block in Chicago or Atlanta. As I have walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men, I have told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problem. But they ask, and rightly so, what about Vietnam? They ask if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problem. And I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. America and most of its newspapers applauded me in Montgomery. And I stood before thousands of Negroes getting ready to riot when my home was bombed, and said, we can't do it this way. They applauded us in the sit-in movement. We nonviolently decided to sit in at lunch counters. They applauded us on the freedom rides when we accepted blows without retaliation. Oh, the press was so noble in its applause and so noble in its praise when I was saying, be nonviolent toward Bull Connor. There's something strangely inconsistent about a nation and a press that will praise you when you say be nonviolent toward Jim Clark, but will curse and damn you when you say be nonviolent toward little brown Vietnamese children. There's something wrong with that press. Another burden of responsibility was placed upon me in 1964. I cannot forget that the Nobel Peace Prize was not just something taking place, but it was a commission to work harder than I had ever worked before for the brotherhood of man. This is a calling that takes me beyond national allegiances, but even if it were not present, I would yet have to live with the meaning of my commitment through the ministry of Jesus Christ. To me, the relationship of this ministry to the making of peace is so obvious that I sometimes marvel at those who ask me why I'm speaking against the war. Could it be that they do not know that the good news was meant for all men, for communists and capitalists, for their children and ours, for black and white, for revolutionary and conservative? Have they forgotten that my ministry is in obedience to the one who loved his enemies so fully that he died for them? What then can I say to the Viet Cong or to Castro or to Mao as a faithful minister to Jesus Christ? Can I threaten them with death? Or must I not share with them my life? There will be no meaningful solution until some attempt is made to know these people and hear their broken cry. And who are we supporting in Vietnam today? It's a man by the name of General Key, who fought with the French against his own people, and who said on one occasion that the greatest hero of his life is Hitler. This is who we are supporting in Vietnam today. Oh, our government and the press generally won't tell us these things, but God told me to tell you this morning. The truth must be told. All the while, the people read our leaflets and received regular promises of peace and democracy and land reform. Now they languish under our bombs and consider us, not their fellow Vietnamese, the real enemy. They see the children degraded by our soldiers as they beg for food. We have destroyed their two most cherished institutions, the family and the village. We have destroyed their land and their crops. This is the role our nation has taken. The role of those who make peaceful revolutions impossible by refusing to give up the privileges and the pleasures that comes from the immense profits of overseas investments. I'm convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin to shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, when machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people. The giant triplets of racism, militarism, and economic exploitation are incapable of being conquered. A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our present policies. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. A true revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth with righteous indignation. It will look across the seas and see individual capitalists of the West investing huge sums of money in Asia, Africa, and South America, only to take the profits out with no concern for the social betterment of the countries, and say this is not just. It will look at our alliance with the landed gentry of Latin America and say this is not just. The Western arrogance of feeling that it has everything to teach others and nothing to learn from them is not just. A true revolution of values will lay hands on the world order and say of war, this way of settling differences is not just. This business of burning human beings with napalm, of filling our nation's homes and with orphans and widows, of injecting poisonous drugs of hate into the veins of peoples normally humane, of sending men home from darkened blooded, physically handicapped, and psychologically deranged, cannot be reconciled with wisdom, justice, and love. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. It is a sad fact that because of comfort, complacency, a morbid fear of communism, our proneness to adjust to injustice, the Western nations that initiated so much of the revolutionary spirit of the modern world have now become the arch anti-revolutionaries. Our only hope today lies in our ability to recapture the revolutionary spirit and go out into a sometimes hostile world, declaring eternal hostility to poverty, racism, and militarism. A genuine revolution of values means, in the final analysis, that our loyalties must become ecumenical rather than sectional. Every nation must now develop an overriding loyalty to mankind as a whole in order to preserve the best in their individual societies. This call for a worldwide fellowship that lifts neighborly concern beyond one's tribe, race, class, and nation is in reality a call upon all embracing unconditional love for all men. This oft misunderstood and misinterpreted concept, so readily dismissed by the niches of the world as a weak and cowardly force, has now become an absolute necessity for the survival of mankind. Let me say finally that I oppose the war in Vietnam because I love America. I speak out against this war not in anger, but with anxiety and sorrow in my heart, and above all with a passionate desire to see our beloved country stand as the moral example of the world. I speak out against this war because I'm disappointed with America. And there can be no great disappointment where there is no great love. I'm disappointed with our failure to deal positively and forthrightly with the triple evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism. We are presently moving down a dead-end road that can lead to national disaster. America has strayed to the far country of racism and militarism. All men are made in the image of God. All men are brothers. All men are created equal. Every man is an heir to a legacy of dignity and worth. Every man has rights that are neither conferred by nor derived from the state. They are God-given. Out of one blood, God made all men to dwell upon the face of the earth. What a marvelous foundation for any home. What a glorious and healthy place to inhabit. America strayed away, and this unnatural excursion has brought only confusion and bewilderment. It has left hearts aching with guilt and minds distorted with irrationality. It is time for all people of conscience to call upon America to come back home. Come home, America. I call on Washington today. I call on every man and woman of goodwill all over America today. I call on the young men of America who must make a choice today. Take a stand on this issue. Tomorrow may be too late. And don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, "You're too arrogant." Now, it isn't easy to stand up for truth and for justice. Sometimes it means being frustrated when you tell the truth and take a stand. Sometimes it means losing a job, means being abused and scorned, may mean having a 7 or 8-year-old child asking your daddy, "Why do you have to go to jail so much?" I've long since learned that to be a follower of Jesus Christ means taking up the cross. And my Bible tells me that Good Friday comes before Easter. For the crown we wear, there is the cross that we must bear. Let us bear it. Bear it for truth. Bear it for justice. And bear it for peace. Let us go out this morning with that determination. And I have not lost faith. I'm not in despair. I haven't lost faith because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. We shall overcome because the Bible is right. You shall reap what you sow. This faith, we will be able to speed up the day when justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. This faith, we will be able to speed up the day when the lion and the lamb will lie down together, and every man will sit under his own vine and fig tree, and none shall be afraid, because the words of the Lord have spoken it. With this faith, we will be able to speed up the day when all over the world we will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, "Free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last." With this faith, we'll sing it as we are getting ready to sing it now. Men will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. And nations will not rise up against nations, neither shall they study war anymore. And I don't know about you, I ain't gonna study war no more.
Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Mahalia Jackson.
I lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. Gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside. I didn't want no more, and I ain't gonna anyone more, anyone more, Lord. I didn't want no more, Lord. I didn't want no more.
Hello, everybody. I welcome you, and I especially welcome Dr. David Anthony, who, as many of you know, is professor of African history at UCSC and has been teaching and living in Santa Cruz since 1988. David Anthony has worked in Tanzania, Lesotho, South Africa. His professional research includes African and African American linkages and history, art, music, literature, and cinema, African languages, Islamic civilization, and much more. Professor Anthony is a leader in campus and community life here in Santa Cruz, including the UCSC annual Martin Luther King Memorial Convocation. David also plays saxophone and flute and is a grandparent. Welcome you all, and welcome David.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation, Peter and Resource Center. Thank you everybody for devoting some of your Saturday morning to this series of thoughts and conversations, reminiscences without nostalgia, rededications, reinvigorations, and perhaps reinventions, thinking back on a time that was long ago in some ways, and perhaps not long enough ago in others, in that there are so many resonances with the time. To kind of contextualize that moment, April 4th, 1967, that we are commemorating at this time, a time to break the silence beyond Vietnam was the name of the speech. And we heard not that speech, which was 56 minutes, and of course is quite available to you. You can listen to it online. And one of the things that I did this morning was to listen to it again. The text was very helpfully inserted into the email, reminding folks about this event, so you can go back to that. And I would say first and foremost, take a little bit of time, if not today, certainly this weekend, for those of you who are part of the Easter tradition, and for those of you who are part of the human tradition, it is very apposite to return to it now, because many of the points that it hits, and the reason that we chose this particular excerpt was because it had, in a very succinct way, touched a lot of the notes that the longer but more conversational speech touched, starting with his Dr. King's exhortation to abandon, to move away from, but also to counteract what he referred to as the triplet, the three evils of racism, rampant materialism, which he also described as economic exploitation, and poverty. He put all of them together so that you recognize the connection, and militarism. And so those three tones, those three themes were linked in this. Another point that is extremely important, starting with the focus on Vietnam, which in 1967 was on everyone's mind, not only in the United States, but in the world, was the global struggle against imperialism and for people's democracy. So I would like you then, as you consider the importance of this moment, to also consider its context. So the text is something I think you should return to. You should read it, you should listen to it, because it is extremely instructive. And I said a few minutes ago, return to this not in a spirit of nostalgia, but I think as a clarion call to action about now. And it's very interesting to think of some of the words in the Riverside Church speech. He uses the phrase, the fierce urgency of now. Now, somebody else took that phrase and applied it to a different moment. It's important to be clear about context. That phrase was about mobilizing the masses. It was about this call to conscience against the unconscionable, against the effects of rampant militarism at the expense of social programs. And if you think about the applicability and the connections between both of those, you recognize the timelessness, if you will. And in some ways, it's an unfortunate timelessness that we are still grappling with some of these same fundamental problems that he was talking about in 1967 here in 2021. Now, there are a whole lot of other things going on at this particular moment. I was fortunate to have been alive at that moment, but I was still coming to consciousness. In 1967, I was 15 years old. And so listening to this and reading it at different points in my life is also a reminder of how consciousness, in fact, is achieved. It is achieved through trial and error, through many mistakes, and sometimes through the frustration of naive hopes. One of the naive hopes that I entertained was that being part of a movement that I thought and others thought could make change for people in a positive direction, in a progressive direction, could also make change for all time. But that's not the way it works. Change is not static, because the forces that oppose change are not static. They're not going to sit back and watch. Often they sit back and they watch you to learn from you and take your tactics and strategy and then use it against you in order to reestablish the status quo, things as they are, or, as is often the case, the status quo ante, things as they were before. So anybody who wants to remove voting rights wants to take us back to things as they were before. But we shouldn't overstate things as they are, because voting rights are still in peril. They are still limited. That's why that struggle is so immediate. That's why it is so important for those who wish to restrict the franchise to find ways to do so, because they see the power of the people. It has been expressed in places like Georgia, in spite of all the blocks and obstacles that were thrown in its path, in spite of all the people who were prevented from getting to the polls, and who, once getting to the polls, had their votes disallowed, or people who were struck off the rolls for infractions. All of these things. It's a dynamic process. And in dealing with that dynamism, I came to realize there is nothing that one changes for all time. So here we are, generations later, having similar conversations. Some aspects of those conversations are distressingly similar. Some are a little bit different in terminology, in verbiage, but no less problematic. So you sit down and you consider the context of that particular speech. In 1967, at Riverside Church, sponsored by a group that was called Clergy and Laymen Concerned. Well, that group no longer calls itself that. It calls itself now Clergy and Laity Concerned, which is less male. It was a very male-focused moment. Dr. King opened up by thanking Dr. Commager, Professor Bennett, Rabbi Heschel. Dr. Commager was Henry Steele. Commager was one of the premier American historians in the 1960s. Professor Bennett was the great Professor Lerone Bennett Jr., one of the most important African-American historians, who was prolific and who also understood how to get his message to the masses. So he, in partnership with Johnson Publishing, produced books and distributed them through the network of Ebony, which John H. Johnson edited. So this historian was one of those people with whom the African-American masses could identify. He was not attached to ivory tower institutions. He was part and parcel of the struggle, as was, or as were many other historians. Vincent Harding, who was very, very close to Dr. King, the founder of the Institute of the Black World, very much involved in this particular speech and in others, okay, who I had the opportunity to meet a number of times. I was mentioning to Peter the last time right here, Santa Cruz at Inner Light Ministries, talking about this very speech, by the way. John Hope Franklin, the Dean of African American Historians, who wrote the historical narrative that was used as the basis for Brown versus Board of Education, in the landmark case that was combining many others that led to the beginning of the dismantling of the structural manifestation of racism, the system of Jim Crow. Something that as a strategy was initially envisioned in the 1940s by Charles Hamilton Houston and a body of his mentees, we could say disciples, his students, including people like Thurgood Marshall, Constance Baker, known as Constance Baker Motley, and all kinds of other folks. And when he passed away, through the agency of the NAACP's legal division, that case was taken and won in the Warren Court. That historian, John Hope Franklin, wrote for that brief. He wrote the historical section on structural racism and its effects, which is to say that history, the narrative, can be deployed at the service of the people in quest of democratization and liberation. All of these things came together. The power of Miss Mahalia, the conscience of the movement, all of this came together. So as we approach this, we can go back over some of the themes, but we can also think about the question that I thought would be a really good one to begin with, since this speech is called A Time to Break the Silence. And it is thinking beyond Vietnam. What silences do we need to break here and now? The parallels seem so clear. In 1967, the great excuse for annihilating people, for the genocide that was visited upon the Vietnamese, was the fear of communism. In order to get people to risk their lives, you've got to give them a cover story. You've got to give them an enemy. You've got to give them a scapegoat. You've got to give them a rationale. And this was the rationale for the escalation that occurred at the expense of the poor, of the hungry, of the naked, the unclothed, the unhoused, the ill-fed, the diseased. And that when the movement addressed this, not only through Dr. King, but others, that movement was challenging the bases upon which all of those evils were constructed. The evil of the neglect of the poor. And poverty had no limitation in terms of color. Poverty struck Black folk, brown folk, yellow folk, red folk, white folk. And it was talking about people as people across faiths and into those who had no faith, whose faith was not necessarily an institution, understood within the Abrahamic tradition, but maybe whose faith was the faith in hope of people, of protecting them. That lifting them all up as being the reason for anyone's call. If someone said they had a call to minister, he was speaking from the social gospel. The social gospel, which had as its center relieving the burdens of the poor, of the oppressed, the downtrodden, the forgotten, and being truthful about the motivations of people who wanted to keep others down, that it was their greed, avarice, one of the deadly sins, their concern for themselves and not others. By using methods like racism, using the police power of the state, both literally and metaphorically, the policeman of the world, assuming that role, and using police as vehicles for suppressing the vitality, the democratic urges, the capability of dissenting and exercising the right of protest, which was clear in 1967, just as it was clear in 2020 and 2021. So that the great bête noire, the great black beast, and it's always interesting what is called black, at that time was communism. But from the standpoint of the anti-imperialist movement, for some, that was a tool, but really it was self-determination. That was the priority. How do we disengage ourselves from those who would seek to control us, especially in a world that was struggling against colonialism? And this is one of the great elements of this speech. That Dr. King talks about the evolution of the self-determination thrust, the national consciousness within Vietnam. He talks about the evolution of that process between 1945 and 1954. So there's a lot in that that has ripples. He also talks about other places. He talks about other struggles for human and civil rights in other continents. The struggle against the landed gentry in Latin America. The struggle against minority rule in Southern Africa. He specifically mentions Mozambique, and he mentions South Africa. So if you look at all of these different strands, it is not accidental that in making these kinds of connections, he is also putting his own life at peril. Because he is talking about not just a subset of American history. And there is nothing sub about the struggle for civil rights of peoples of African descent, locally or globally. He is talking about the liberation of humanity. And that is dangerous. It was dangerous in 1967, and it's dangerous in 2021. The clarity and the courage that it takes to connect struggles, understanding that there are distinctions, there are specificity, but there are always also areas of intersection. That's what makes Black Lives Matter so resonant to people in Britain, in other parts of Europe, in Australia, in Nigeria, because they see the core as anti-democratic oppression, and that for the movement to liberate humankind, one has to recognize that connectedness. A lot of that is really clear in the core thrust of this speech. I think that's a good place to start for the moment.
Thank you, David. Thank you for bringing the lives of especially Black historians who I need to learn more about into this conversation and the many broader contexts of this speech. And thank you for this focus. What silences do we need to break here and now? I open it up to anybody. Maybe raise your hand and I'll go around and try to keep a stack going. And remember to unmute when you're ready. What silences do we need to break here and now? Willow, unmute before you start. Yes.
Well, one of the things that has been very concerning for me locally, nationally, and globally is the issue of Palestine and the current breaks within some of the different parts of our movement locally, that some people hold hostilities toward others because of different positions on Israel-Palestine. And I've been very inspired by Combatants for Peace for many years, and they've come here several times. And I've talked to some of the people who hold hostility against some parts of the peace movement here and the anti-colonial, anti-racist movement. And I don't feel a lot of hope for reconciliation with some of that. And so that's something that's scary to talk about in some places. But it's very important. And I'm very supportive of the courage of Angela Davis and other people who consistently raise that. There have been a lot of webinars lately about the connection of Palestine movement for liberation to all the other movements against white supremacy and racism, et cetera. And it's very important, and the silence needs to be broken. I know the RCNV has been very strong in breaking that silence.
Thank you, Willow. And in our time together, we either can pick up on what others have said or bring and introduce something new. since we have limited time, would especially want to hear from what's on your mind. I will, do I see you raising your hand, Robert? Yes, great.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I wanted to say that I really appreciated David's talk, and I thought that the point that I got the most, I'm sorry, it's a little bit off of the breaking the silences, but when he said that the forces against change are not static. They will use your tactic and strategy to reestablish the status quo ante. I just thought that's so brilliant. that even like with the Vietnam War, the forces of militarism basically used, their defeat in the war as in effect, an excuse to become even more, that the militarism has even increased by doing something like what the Confederates did with the Lost Cause, in terms of creating. I don't want to go into it too much, but the basic principle, that the forces that we're fighting against never quit, that they will always figure out ways of fighting against the change and will fight to reestablish. And we see it most dramatically, of course, with the way that Jim Crow 2 is trying to be reestablished, certainly with the voting rights. Anyway, I just wanted to say that that was what really struck me, and I thought that was just really, really profound.
Thank you, Robert. Enid Lee asked us to be even more pointed. What silences do we need to break here and now in Santa Cruz about Santa Cruz? And Willow puts one in the chat, but I want to make an opportunity, just a little bit of quiet for somebody who hasn't spoken yet, Willow. Enid. Unmute.
Yes, I put that question in because the last time that I heard Professor Anthony speak, and it was in February, in Black History Month, he talked about a silence regarding the recall of Councillor Drew Glover. I don't know if the silence has been broken about that since then, but I thought I would put that question in case this was a moment to do some breaking around that silence. That's what I wanted to do with that. And we don't have to say anything further about it if it's been discussed, but I remember the last time I heard him speak, which was February, about it, he spoke of it as a silence that was to be broken. So I put it there, and, we can do what we need to do about it, but that is my effort at continuing the breaking that needs to be done, in my view. Thank you.
Peter.
Yes.
Dave Bunchy down
Hi,
here.
Dave.
Speaking. Hi, Peter.
Get it?
We are tuning in from Los Angeles. We knew Peter from before Santa Cruz days. And Martin Luther King has meant a great deal in our lives, so that's why we tuned in, and we appreciate you having this. One thing that I'm a retired United Methodist minister, and one thing I want to affirm, Dr. Anthony, in your presentation is one of the silences is is about our sin. That so much of colonialism is about ego, about you know, what's for me, what's in it, what's mine, and that's a battle. You know, that's a battle to be fought all the time. Is it about the other or is it about me? And of course, you know, here it is, Holy Saturday. Jesus died on that question, and loving even his enemies beyond everything he had to give, and so that's I think that's, we're just too darn silent about naming greed where it exists, and then also offering up, you know, the other thing about King's life is it was sacrificial. He was willing to take the blows of reputation, of opposition, and then of course ultimately and then jailing, but ultimately his life. And you know, tomorrow is Resurrection Sunday in the Christian tradition, and it's just a reminder that life doesn't end with life. And I think that's what King believed. And anyway, that's a silence we've been too long holding, both the greed end and the opportunity for us to offer ourselves in service to others. Thank you.
I would like to just call attention to the comments that have been made in the chat, which are very important. And I want to thank Willow for a number of points that she laid out. I really appreciate everything that's been said thus far, and I'm very mindful. I was just trying to be selective in focusing on a few concerns, but I'm also really cognizant of this time. When Peter and I had this conversation, we were trying to decide when this weekend would be the best time to do this. You know, we talked about Good Friday, we talked about today, we talked about tomorrow, Easter, and my suggestion was this particular day, but I'm really cognizant of the intersection of the Abrahamic traditions. I'm cognizant of the coincidence of Pesach, of Passover. So Zissen Pesach, for those of you who are part of the Jewish tradition who are observant, but also we've got in a fortnight the onset of Ramadan, the holy month for Muslims. So the fact that these traditions exist in propinquity, in neighborhoods, I think are very important. And I think it's also interesting in the light of what Dave mentioned. I was thinking about the sacrifice, not only of Dr. King, but of so many people within the movement. His was very emblematic and very public. that you had so many people who gave the last measure of their lives. Many more than I think are typically acknowledged. You know, people who were involved in court cases, people who were public prosecutors, people who were civil rights workers, people of all backgrounds and colors. But I also think that because one of the concerns that was enunciated by Dr. King was the importance within understanding the Gandhian tradition, the traditions of nonviolent civil disobedience and passive resistance, satyagraha, the notion of unearned suffering, which is that there are people who suffer and who are sacrificed, who don't necessarily wish to suffer or be sacrificed. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, so many people who are part of our consciousness and our practice now. Someone posted very presciently recently on LinkedIn that George Floyd is not on trial.
Mm.
It is not the George Floyd trial. It is the trial of his murderer. Nor was Rodney King. People talk about the Rodney King trial. Rodney King was not on trial. It was the abusers, the police, who beat him. So it's important to be clear about the narrative, to control the narrative, not let others control it for us. And that we need to try to find ways to be supportive of the people who need that support, whether they are immigrants on borders who are being shuttled to one place or another, whether there are incarcerated people within this country or in black sites. It is black again, in Guantanamo, who are subject to rendition. People in camps all over the world. People who have bombs rain down upon them. People who are subject to oppression, to discrimination, to death because of their sexual orientation, because of their identification, because others don't know what to make of them. Mm-hmm. They suffer for that. Transphobia, homophobia. The continuing trafficking of human beings, the abuse of people of all kinds of description. Children, minors, people who are trying to work, people who are just trying to be, people who have been kept from healthcare, people who are homeless, people who are in need, who simply need to be seen and heard and taken seriously. The human struggle is a very large one. And what Dr. King was talking about was connecting the struggles. And that's what makes these moments, this last decade, for example, so significant, so powerful, and so fearsome to the forces of reaction.
I was, among many thoughts, thinking of the interplay between the Abrahamic religions and Buddhism and other means for humans, African religions, other means for humans to identify the value of life and of community, versus the greed, the word that in a way King was even silent about, capitalism, and I mean, in part, people have sacrificed in that battle all through history. And of course, I think, Dr. Anthony and King are asking us now, where are we now in that battle? And I still see in myself this contest between like a childhood given belief in America and just continual learning of the sins and evils of this nation in particular. For me, white body supremacy is something that most of us are silent about, and that we, people tend to deny its role, say, in the recall of Drew Glover, or deny Drew's experience growing up as a discovering Black boy and then man here in Santa Cruz. Just to make that slight connection. But I think, and then the other word that King uses, nationalism. I mean, there's just so many ways in which the Democratic Party, along with the Republican Party, just put America first, and just a nicer America. Like King said, there's certain kinds of nonviolence that were approved in 1967, and other kinds that weren't, by the government and those supporting the status quo. I continue to be provoked by this speech, and it is really disturbing to see how much is not changed. And I believe in King's call to be revolutionaries in whatever way. And again, there's a disconnect between a lot of my everyday life and that belief. But I do think kind of breaking the kind of de facto belief in this, is so much about this country, along with belief in people. For what Dr. Anthony was saying, the phrase that Paul Ortiz lifts up, emancipatory internationalism, the stories of the people who contributed in our country to liberation, especially people of African descent and people of indigenous and Latin American descent and Asian descent, Middle Eastern descent, who have contributed to liberation here, is important. Anyway, that's a few thoughts, and let me invite others. We'll just go for another 10 minutes probably. So welcome somebody who maybe hasn't spoken yet. Anybody can raise your hand or reveal your video if you like. I appreciate that each of you have prioritized being together. Susan is raising your hand.
Hi.
And Teresa. Susan first.
Thank you, and thank you so much, Dr. Anthony, for everything you said. What Edith Lee brought up, Drew Glover and silence around that, and that I'm referring to, Dr. Anthony, and just looking locally at the silence that is, how am I being silent around that, and how are we, and the people, you know, the people who, the groups who initiated that recall, and who I sorry, I'm not steeped enough in it, but as far as the TOLO, the temporary outdoor living ordinance, and then who initiated that, and is supporting that, and so that, you know, so what's, how are we silent about what's happening? Because I think it's that those things are connected, you know, the whatever's getting in the way of Santa Cruz developing, and in the way certain people who have money and power want it to be developed. How are we bringing all of the struggles of people in Santa Cruz together to bring that to the light, I, you know, just, well, I have a lot of ideas about it, but how do we stop being silent? Who do we, it's because Santa Cruz is a reflection of the country and the world, not as far as, you know, the demographics and the balance there, but just as we need to unify, bring all the people together who want to go against these forces that want Santa Cruz to be a certain way, that's not welcoming all people. So yeah, I'm just throwing that out. That's a silence that for me needs to, yeah. And then I'll say one more thing, that then also includes the police and they're just seem to be like right there with Tolo and you know, their involvement and the plans for their involvement. And so yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Teresa, did you have your hand up before? I didn't know if you did.
I was more just saying hello to everyone, but I did notice something that's not lost on me when I think about my own silence, is that King and so many of the people who stepped to the fore to call out state-sanctioned predation in the United States were either assassinated, imprisoned, or had to leave in order not to be assassinated and imprisoned. And I was born in 1967, so this context of state-sanctioned predation, which you can see in the carceral state, and you can see in so much of our colonial violence in the United States, both abroad and in the sacrificial zones that are created in the States. And I start to realize that when I'm reflecting upon white body supremacy and my experience of it, I'm starting to see that growing up in that context has created a lot of fear for me around resisting the system or speaking out. And that's an important piece that I've noticed in terms of silence, in terms of starting to really question how unsafe am I really, or is that an inherited sort of ancestral trauma? I mean, it wasn't lost on my parents what happens to you when you speak out, and especially from the Mexican side of my family, who are quite new to the States. And I just find that very helpful to name it aloud for myself. I didn't grow up in a country where I thought this was a really safe place. I sort of quietly observed and also picked up from, I think, a lot of adults what the real situation was, or what a lot of how violence was just such a overpowering experience in the United States in so many different ways. Yeah, and so that's something I still struggle with. And I look at how colonial violence and ecological crisis are so tied together. And yet I often see the ecological struggle is not tied, the people who are concerned about ecological struggle and the people who are concerned about fighting white supremacy and colonial violence in the past were really pulled apart. So anyway, now I just wanted to name that.
Thank you. Enid.
I'm muted now. Yes, right. Just wanted to say very briefly that I find the message that change is not static, and that's a very hopeful message. For me, it is a joyful message at Easter time, because what it says to me is that even if it's changed today, it can be changed back to what it was before, and therefore being defeated or discouraged about that is really not an option. One has to just anticipate that this will happen and you keep going. So I find it a wonderful Easter gift. The place that I grew up in, Easter is the most enjoyable holiday. We have 4 days, from Holy Thursday to the Tuesday after Easter Monday. Everything is closed down. We fly kites, we go to church, we have picnics, and it is a joyful time. And so I wanted to thank Professor Anthony for that message, that reminder that change is not static, that it can be changed back, and that feeling defeated because it's changed back doesn't work. There's no point to it. That's not necessary to keep going. And that even a question cautiously placed, as I placed the one about Councillor Drew Gravel, is enough. That's what I could do today. I have no idea what the silence would look like if it were totally broken, but that is what I could do from where I'm sitting in Santa Cruz. And I want to thank him and everyone here for the space where we could practice what it means to break a silence, even about a place as wonderful as Santa Cruz is. Thank you.
And thank you, Enid. Joy is a part of liberation. And thank you for the story, your Easter story. Would someone else like to comment even a little?
It sounds like everybody's broken the silence. It doesn't take much. It does take some courage.
You're here. And mutual support. Well, I think I will thank you all for joining together, and maybe I'll look for a kite to fly. Babadada.
I just thank you, Professor Anthony and everyone. I just had this thought, and it's a thought that came into me sometime in my life, and it has allowed me to make the steps that I've needed to open my wings, to seek truth and freedom. And that is, the world doesn't end when we speak our truth. It only ends when we don't. And that I wanted to share. The world doesn't end when we speak our truth. It only ends when we don't. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhavananda, for the benediction. Thank you, David. Thanks, everyone, for being together. And be well, and we will keep speaking in verbal and nonverbal ways, and off Zoom as well as on Zoom. Thanks all. Thank you, David.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Happy holidays, and stay safe and healthy. Thank you, Willow.
Thank you, Willow.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I was trying to deal with my devices, so I missed that. That was beautiful. Thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you for all you bring. And thanks, David.
Thank you.
I really appreciate the care you put into preparing for this, and yeah, very good.
Thank you.
All right, be well.
Okay.
Take good care.
Your family. See you.
Liberatory emancipation.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I'll end it.